Basically, my focus on the seminar today, been working on guns over 30 years, starting about 1985, 86, and I've had the opportunity through the years to do a lot of restoration. So having that, you get afforded the opportunity to go take a lot of guns. You get the opportunity to take a lot of these old antique guns apart, and you also find out why they have issues, whether they're cracks, breaks, sometimes it's structural issues that are internal that was created during the process of construction. So the focus for this seminar is actually to try to relay some things that we see that are fairly common. I've seen through the years where people will take an order for a gun and they think that for some reason, because the guy's not going to shoot the gun very much, maybe he just wants it as a decorative item, they don't actually take the time to build it for the bad weather, they don't build it for horses, they don't build it for hard usage or lots of rain or snow. And you'll cut corners on it because you know the guy that's outcome that ordered it is probably not going to use it very hard. But what you see is sometimes the guns get turned down to family members to the next generation, and they do want to use it. Or they go up for auction, they come up out here on the market again, and they get used by people that really go out and want to camp in the weather, they want to hunt in the snow, and the rifles don't hold up for the long term. So my thing is, if you're going to build a rifle, it doesn't take much longer to do it right as it does to do it half-assed. So why don't you just do it right the first time? And the other side of it is, if a gunsmith takes that gun apart 100 years from now, what do you want him to see? Is he going to open it up and there's tons of epoxy inside? Is he going to open it up and see big gaps and cavities and stuff that you wouldn't be proud of having seen? And it may be 100 years from now, but it might be 2 years from now on somebody else's bench. So if you're going to build something, take the time to do the very best work that you can. So basically, this is a rifle I finished about a month ago. I'm going to go through some of the details which don't show on the outside of the gun as far as in construction. The first thing you need to decide is when you're going to build a rifle, think about the piece of wood that you're using. Everybody wants the beautiful, most curly, burly piece of wood. But a piece of wood actually has internal stress. If you've ever done any carpentry work, you split a 2x4, and the 2x4 goes two different ways. It's relieving internal stress. And even though maple is harder than a piece of pine, it still has internal stresses. The more curly it is, the more stress that you have built up in it. If you look at a lady that has curly hair, it has wave. When it gets wet, it stretches and it gets longer. The wood does the same thing. When you have a piece of curly maple that has this whip to it, the grain structure is actually curving a lot like a washboard. But when it gets wet, it tends to want to stretch. And it'll go lengthwise as much as sideways, mostly on the length. So when you're picking your piece of wood, a piece of quarter sawn wood is beautiful because of the structure. You see more curl. To give it an idea, if you take a book and say that's your piece of wood, and the pages are actually the growth rings of that tree. And so you take all the pages like this. If you lay that, and it's a piece of curly maple that has a good curl, and you turn it, your prettiest curl is going to be on the edges of the book, where the grain's going sideways. So as soon as you look at it, you say, that's a really pretty grain structure. I call it a ray. You'll see that flecking or ray that comes off on a piece of curly maple. So when I get an old gun and do restoration, to figure out how to index the new wood that you need to add, you can actually turn it, and as soon as you see this ray or flecking that's happening, that tells you that the growth structure, the growth rings are going side, or they may be going up or down. It's like this rifle, I can turn it, and the weakest part of the grain structure is here. So what that's telling me is your growth rings are running like that. Downside with a piece of quarter sawn wood, the plus side is you get the grain on the side of the gun, not the top and bottom. The downside is the the grain structure runs out the wrist. So that means you have linear curves and layers of this way. So it makes your wrist weaker and longer. Where a piece of slab sawn wood, where the grain structure is going up and down, tends to be stronger because all the growth grains going this way, but you get less curl. That's why many of the gun guys that cut wood, they tend to cut it on a slight bit of a curve, so you get curl here and here, which is kind of a compromise on it. Then you got the one rare thing is when they get the stump wood. Stump wood is where they're getting those stock planks right out of the bottom of the stump, so you're getting the root structures coming down, and that's where you get a quarter sawn piece of wood where you can have it and the grain actually, the layers actually run down the wrist. So you get the curl on the sides, and that's normally when you see the curl going and down through the butt. So those are the couple. When I pick a piece of wood, I like a nice piece of curly maple, and I like a really curly burly piece of wood because I just find it interesting and unusual. But you have to know that if you get it in bad weather, it's going to want to move. And so there's certain things you can do to help allow it to lose its stress and come back. One of the details, and I'm going to try to put these notes up here, not so much for you, but for me, so I don't forget stuff. So when you're picking your piece of wood, I like to buy a piece of wood and I put it in my shop a minimum of 5 years before I use it. I don't care if it's been kiln dried, I don't care if it's air dried. I buy it at home, I set it in my shop. The old timers that build cabinets, they used to say you let the wood marry with the shop. What that means is the humidity is going to come to an equal level in that piece of wood in your shop. So when you're building it, if you go pick it up in the barn and you bring it over, you buy it here and you take it home and start cutting it, there's going to be more moisture content in there possibly than what your shop has. So I prefer to buy a piece of wood. I mark when I buy it, I put it in the shop, and I leave it there about normally 5. I got some pieces of wood that are 25 to 30 years old that I haven't used. Not because I'm saving them, but just like to make it happen. So a pretty piece of wood is a pretty piece of wood. Then when I get ready to build a rifle, I take the time that I set my own barrels and do my own ramrod holes and do everything in shop. So the same day that I set the gun barrel, so I'll take the stock plank, cut out the top, set the barrel on the stock. Same day I flip it over, cut the bottom side, put the ramrod groove through and go ahead and drill the ramrod. And at the same time, the same day, go ahead and scab the wood off the 2 sides. So what I've done is I've taken wood all the way around that piece of wood. You've taken the stress off the whole thing, and then I bind it. Either you can use tape if you want to. If I use a tape, normally I run it backwards on itself so it's not sticking to the wood, and then I make it round with a piece of tape, flip it over, and run it back on itself. And what it does, it keeps that glue from being over the barrel, which is a pain when you're at brown and glue it later on. So bind the piece of wood with it. Then I sit it in the corner and it sits there sometimes a year, sometimes 6 months. And that lets it lose its stress before I start cutting on it anymore. So you basically, key is you're cutting a big hunk out of the inside, you're taking this out on the bottom side, and go ahead and scab the sides. So it relieves some of your stress. Your tenons or draw loops on the bottom of the barrel are one of the more important features that you have on the gun. Because you have to keep in mind, because you're thinning that forestock out so much, you're going to, when you lose and take that much wood out of there, this is a thin part of the wood itself. So when, like my little rifle, which is up there, I've had since 2005, when I take it in Colorado or I take it out in the hunt with it in the rain, my nose cap sits back off the front about a nickel square. So the nickel on the top of the nose cap. If you make that flush with the gun, when the gun gets wet and moist and humidity, it's going to come out all the way past the muzzle of your rifle. Then when it shrinks, what will happen, especially with my little guy, he'll shrink and he'll swell out to the muzzle, and when he comes back shorter than he did the first time. And every time he gets wet, he goes right back to where he used to, but he almost always shrinks a tiny bit less than it was before. So what turned into a nickel ends up being a little more than a nickel as time goes, because it swells back. It'll level out after a period of time, but your wood is going to move. These loops on the bottom, here, need to be big enough. You'll see draw loops that you can buy that aren't a loop, it's actually a web. And people will come in here and drill a hole in the middle of a solid piece. What doesn't allow the wood to move it. So what happens is it either pushes out and cracks in a purl ring, which I've had them in the shop, I've had it fixed for people. It doesn't allow any motion. And then if you do use a loop, whether you want a dovetail loop or you do a staked in loop or holes, that's fine, either one. But allow yourself enough space on here, whether you're using a pin or you're coming in and putting a wedge pin, like a flat wedge pin like this. So you have enough movement, because you have to keep in mind, you say, okay, it moves, pick a number, 10 thousandths here. It moves 10 thousandths here. No, it actually moves. This one moves for this one moves 3 times to go to this one moves 4 times. So every time you magnify, this guy's going to get really tight if you don't have enough play space in there. Not just a little bit, but a fair amount of movement that it can shrink and expand. Also, if you're using a wedge pin, I'll make little wedge pins from scratch. But you can go in here and cut out, so you got your wedge pin. A lot of the originals had what I call a keeper slot. And what that is just a simple slot that's cut in the middle. You take a drill, punch 2 holes, take the jeweler saw, get down and come back, take that width. And then the last thing you do when you're finished putting the finish to the gun, put your loops in, or put your pins in, and then you put a little tiny pin down inside the stock that comes down and catches this loop. So you'll never lose one of these wedge pins. So when you punch it out, it comes out, it stops here and goes back. It also gives you one more place for expansion. And I didn't think about this until I started taking guns apart, and I had a hard time getting these pins out, because what happens, the gun stretches and moves, it doesn't have anywhere to give. And instead of breaking the wood, what it does, it crushes that web. It'll be a bugger getting it out, but at least the gun stock doesn't hurt. Other side is when you're kind of jump forward here a little bit. When you come in here and you're setting your gun barrel, and after you're finished, when I put my finished surface on the gun, I saturate the inside of that mortise and that barrel chamfer. Yeah. Also, if you're better off taking a Ramrod with a cleaning patch on it, saturate your finish early in the game before you get a nice surface, and run a cleaning patch all the way down through your Ramrod channel. So you're putting finish on the inside of your Ramrod channel, because that's another whole void space that has no protection. And what happens is you're out there hunting in the rain and you set the gun up like this. Where's the water going? The water runs down that Ramrod hole, and it'll end up swelling up where you can't get the rod. So finish inside the barrel, and finish underneath the butt plate. Normally I even put finish inside the lock ring. So the big thing is, if you have a super tight fit, when you put that finish in, you will have to reset that a little bit and take that little feather edge out of there to get everything reset back. But I saturate this butt underneath. I mean, literally daub it, and put as much finish under the butt plate as you can get. Because if you're hunting in the snow and you stuff it down here, normally I set a foot, but if you're hunting like 10, 12 inch snow, I kick the spot and set it down, but it's going to suck all that moisture right up the end grain that's on the bottom of that butt plate, even if you have a good fit. So seal that off. Inside of the patch ball helps to seal that off as well. On your butt plates, like if I didn't bring a screwdriver, but if you take my butt plate off here, I didn't always do this, but I started in recent. If you take this butt plate off, it looks like you put it in clay. It takes longer to do it. A lot of originals are like that. It's a much simpler to just take the bandsaw and go clip, and one off. But what you end up finding is, it takes longer to do it. But what it does is it keeps your butt plate from indexing. If anybody's ever put one on with a salt curve, you put your screws in, and the next thing, your screw jacks the butt plate a little left, or a little right. Or if you have a work screw, you switch it out for the finished final screw you put in it, all of a sudden your butt plate moves back and forth or back. If you leave that wood underneath it and you just keep hand fitting it in there, what you'll find is the butt plate won't move. It can't because it's trapped on this lump and also underneath. There's another thing. When you put your screws in, your screws catch purchase as soon as they get through the brass. As soon as they go through the brass, they're already connecting with a piece of wood. So it takes that, you get more purchase for your screw for the length of it. But also, if you set that gun down and you set it on a rock, man, on some of these soft yellow brass butt plates, they'll collapse, especially some of the Reeves' older butt plates that are thin. And so with having that wood underneath of it, it's solid underneath all the way through. Takes longer, does a much better job. Screws, wood screws, keep in mind when you're buying your wood screws, sometimes make them, your wood screw doesn't have to be 1.5 inches long to hold a butt plate. Your wood screw is only holding that butt plate. So if you have wood coming underneath of it, you don't need a screw more than like 3/4 of an inch max. Because if you're drilling in there and you're putting a 1 inch or 1.5 inch hole, especially in this bottom screw, where it's going into the end grain and working like a wedge, it's going to crack somewhere down the line. It's going to crack this buttstock, which is a very, very common feature you see on original guns. The toes get broken. When they get broken off sometimes, your butt plate screw comes in here, it's hitting the end grain, and this butt plate will shrink and swell. All you have to do is go to any original Fowler, any original Kentucky, and you can take your finger and clip the edges or clip the bottom and see how much shrinkage that piece of wood is. If that screw is too long and it gets forced, it's going to crack the toe. Another thing that helps in the assistance is when you put this bottom screw in, elongate the hole. You don't have to elongate the duct or the countersink. You can put the countersink where you want it, but just take a file and elongate the hole over there. So if the gun shrinks and you get that shrinkage coming in on the bottom, it allows that screw a little bit of mobility to be able to shift. It'll shift on the top. Another thing that's an assistance, you use a conventional machinist bit to drill your holes for your butt plate, especially. You end up with a cylinder. And with that cylinder, you come in here and you put your wood screw in, and all of a sudden, it's easy to put in. It's good, but you get there's no wood connection on the bottom end of the cylinder. I like using what's called a gimlet. A gimlet is just a handle, and then it's got a whole time like a wood screw. You can use a wood screw if you have nothing else to start. But basically, a gimlet is like a drill bit, but it's tapered. It actually has the same. Get a gimlet, and they sell them retail. Some a lot of companies sell these things, or you can buy some originals. But get a gimlet that fits your screws. You hold it up there, it's almost a silhouette of a screw you're doing. You can take your gimlet, put a little leather. You put a little leather grommet around it that fits real tight on the shaft, and take your screw and set it on the gimlet and say, this is how far I got to drill this thing into. And the gimlet is nice because when you're setting this top screw, you can set that screw or set the gimlet in start it, stand there and look at it. Oh, crap, it's too crooked. So all of a sudden it's crooked, so you can start it, you can move it back, put it where you want it, and you can look at it from the side. You give it a couple more turns with the gimlet as it starts going down into the piece of wood, and then you can adjust it instead of sitting there with a drill and thinking you're punching a perfectly square hole with your butt plate and you're not getting it. So gimlet's a nice little tool, and what it will do is give you a tapered hole, so you get purchase from your screw from the very top to the very bottom. Also, try to find screws that do not have a long cob. They don't have to have a super long cob, because that's more space you're having to go down before you're actually catching into the threads of the screw to get a bite. I tend to like ones that have a smaller notch. They're a little more difficult to find. The old time screws that had very fine notches. And the key is, if you find a good solid steel screw that's not plated, and if you go into an antique hardware store, you get on eBay and you find old stock, you see a good one that's maybe 3/4 of an inch long, buy as many as you can. Because if you have enough in your lifetime, you'll never have to worry about it again. And if you get the gimlet set up to where you're doing that same screw every single time, you got the countersink set up for that screw and that deck. Placement of this bottom screw, so you're going to get there. If you put it too low, you're going to be cutting into your grain structure. Too far up, it doesn't give enough support for your butt. I don't have a particular number. I normally just eyeball it according to the gun. And sometimes it makes a difference how wide the gun is, what width you got on the back of it. A little wider gun, you can get away with putting it down a little more. If you have a gun that you're building with a lot of crescent shape, you have to keep in mind that you start putting, especially with crescent shape, now you're pushing down. And when you get shrinkage from that, they will break. You'll get that crack. The toe plate, this rifle, I saw one original that I took apart that it actually had a tab on the back of the toe plate. And that tab, say your toe plate's down here, it actually had a tab that bottom screw went through the back of that tab. And so that's how I'm doing my toe plates now. And what it does is it supports this corner. So when you get the shrinkage, you get movement, this little toe plate, the back tab tends to come out. Even if you dovetail the butt plate and it indexes into there, if shrinkage happens and it swells, it's coming out of there. The little tab that a silver solder on it actually helps keep this guy in place. The only thing I do that helps a little bit, not on the top so much, but on the bottom, elongate that hole so it allows a little more movement. So you get a little bit of movement there. It can't come down, but it can go up. It allows you, when you put that there, that means you don't need a screw right here towards the back end of the toe. You can move the screws forward of the back end of it. And what that's doing is you have this bolt coming through or screw, and all of a sudden you start putting in, when you start putting screws in here, now you're intersecting two separate screws going in the same area on the grain structure that could be going this way or the side. It makes a structural problem. Also, you don't need 1-inch screws to hold the toe plate. It's this thick, and you don't need a great big screw. If you're copying the original and you're looking at it and say, hey, they got a big screw head, just get a really short one. So you don't need a big long screw shoot. It's overkill. I mean, it's, if you're putting inlays in, you don't have to have monstrous pin to hold inlays. But we'll get to that. Structural issues, and this is something you see on the Brown Besson. Your wrist is one of your most fragile areas on the gun. You ever fall off a horse? It's one of the most fragile spots. If you're hunting in a tree stand, you drop the gun out. Most of the time where they break, once in a while you'll see a fracture on the front. Normally it's a gouge or something backs the stink out. your structural issue is normally in this locking piece. So one thing, try not to take any more wood out of the lock than you need to. If possible, you really want it to look like you just push the lock into the mortise into a pile of puff. And you come out and leave as many pieces of wood in there as you can, because that's a very weak area, even though you've got the tang cover. One thing I can tell you is just take your time, put the pieces in one at a time, whether you're using a router or using a chisel. When you're using a chisel and you're working on your lock mortise, keep in mind, if you say this is the surface that you want, so you run your chisel like that. You actually drive your chisel deeper than you need for that mortise. Or you drive your chisel, you're doing this breech plug. Say you're setting the back end of the breech plug, or the plug itself, or in the back of the barrel. If you take that chisel and you drive that thing just a little bit too far past what you need to relieve that mortise out, or whatever you're putting in there, it makes a structural issue where you cut some of that grain across. And if it's going to break, and so many old guns, when they break here, you look and you'll see where they've taken a chisel and cut far too deep into the wood itself and severed all those grain stuff. So when the gun does get a hard whack, it breaks. It's kind of like concrete. You put a check line and then put a relief stress line. When it breaks, it's going to break on the line. And that's what happens in lawn mortises. Same thing, especially with your trigger plates. If you overcut your trigger plate or your mortise area, and you start taking too much wood out of that, you're relieving far too much, and here again, it's a structure. Keep as much wood inside as you possibly can, even though it doesn't show. Save as much as you possibly can. Yes. I tend to, with the rifles I build, whether you're using a double set trigger or a single trigger, the tang bolt is not a screw, it's a bolt. If you put a wood screw down through here, this is what's holding this whole thing together, is a wood screw. Now, a lot of the originals are like that, and as soon as they get whacked here, this screw loses all purchase in itself, and that's where it breaks through lock. Put a bolt through there. It doesn't take that much longer. Your bolt should go down, thread through your trigger plate, whether it's a single or not. On the back side, I temporarily drill it as I'm building the rifle. Come through and put a wood screw in the back, a little short, just to hold everything together. When you get ready to do your thumb piece, which I do a lot of thumb pieces, discussions. The British brown besses were like this. You will see some English valve, where when they put the thumb piece in, it's actually a glorified nut and washer. It sets up on top of it. And so you have a tang bolt that goes through, grabs a hold of that trigger plate. Then you come through the back, and this is almost like a tang bolt itself. That bolt comes out and threads into the bottom of that thumb piece. And what it does is it allows you to do your thumb piece without pins on top. Most of the time, I like a little bit of a bulge on the thumb piece because I like the feel of it. I like the visual look, but also like the feel of it when you throw up and put your finger there, and it indexes you in the same place every time. Same thing with the pipes, which I get to those. I tend to like a bulge on the forward pipe when you build the pipes, just because when I slip my hand out there, it just gives me another metal index, kind of like a kisser button. But what that'll do is it ties your structure strength-wise from steel to steel and back up. And so if you have a piece of quarter saw wood, the grain structure is coming out, it will help hold that wrist together. Yes,
so
sir.
you generally get a stronger wrist if you put a double set trigger in because that plate is longer?
Somewhat, because it comes back farther. But the thing you have to keep in mind is you're taking twice to 4 times as much wood out to put all those strings and stuff. Yeah. I tend to do a lot of single triggers because I like to hunt and a lot. Get away with it. The nice thing about the single trigger is you can pull it back to full cock with no sound. And I've had deer lock it up, whether you're, however your system is, where you go to full cog and then you set your trigger, and then come back. You can do it with a double set, but it's not as safe. I can do that, and I'm already ready to rock. So I do more single triggers, but the double set, you take a lot of meat out of the bottom, putting the set triggers. I tend to taper plates down if you can. Some of the trigger plates are real wide. Keep in mind, every time you take wood out of there, you're losing strength. And some of the plates are very thin, so I make mine from scratch, and I don't know what the thickness is, but I use a fairly thick plate, so I've got some strength from the front all the way to the back. And when you're building those trigger plates, if you're going to do what I just talked about with the bolt, keep in mind mentally and say, okay, I'm going to come here, my thumb piece is going to be sitting here, and I want enough steel on that plate to bring me back to there. So that screw is right in the backside, going up and through the thumb. But the brown besses are done. Also, you can, it's a little more hard work. If you get a piece of wood, you're going to put a really thin wrist and you're worried about somebody cracking the wrist, you can put a rod, you put a steel rod back to it. And I've done that to repair guns, not so much on old guns because they're not getting used for it. But I tend to do that this rifle because I know who's getting it. I know that he's going to use it hard. He will, like I do. I put a steel rod. I tend to use a 3/8. You can get a 5/16, but if you do any smaller than that, you're wasting time. I tend to use a 3/8 rod and drill just behind, under the tang, and drill all the way through. Is it a little bit hairy at times? Yes. It's a little spooky drilling back through there and not wanting to be punching out the sides. But if you can do it, punch that back through, then what happens is that bolt coming back through here, or pin, this screw goes through the middle of that bolt or pin, and this bolt actually goes through the middle of the pin as well. So structurally, it's super, super strong. And if you do that, come in where your trigger plate is, where this little stud comes up for your trigger guard, and drill a little vent hole, just a little air hole, a little tiny. Because when you put your glue in there and you're pushing it back there with the glue, you don't want to start having hydraulics or compression or airlock. So you put the glue all over I use all thread many times because all thread actually helps hold the glue when you're pushing back in there. Slide it back, let it vent out, and then clean it up. But the key is get this hole, not so much this one you want to drill, so the rod's this long. You put it in there, put it in, mark it, drill that hole before you cut that rod. Because otherwise you put the rod in there and you can't get it out. Put it in there, index the hole, mark it, cut it off, and then on the end of that rod, take your saw and put a saw curve in. What that does, it gives you a screwdriver hole. When you push that pin in there, if it's indexed a little sideways, you can stick a screwdriver and you can turn it back and forth to get your hole where you need it for that tank. And if you do that structurally, then the wrist is super, super strong. Lock bolts, hang bolts. When you're putting your tang bolts in, preferably, in a perfect world, everything's perfectly straight. You do not want any space behind like your side. You don't want an air cavity. You don't want an air cavity underneath that side plate when you're tightening up the bolts on it. And your bolts you want strong enough, and when you make your threads, and this is the key to getting a good tang bolt and lock bolt, whether you're making them or whether you're buying them, that have full threads. Sometimes you'll look at it and say, oh, it doesn't give you the full thread. And when you use your die, your tap, and you use your tap to cut the holes, you want as much thread as you can inside that bolt. Otherwise, it's going to strip out. And if the tang bolt strips out, that's a whole separate issue, structural issue. Also, lengthwise, when you're tightening it up, you do not want your lock bolts to extend past the face of the plate when it's dead tight. Because what happens is if they stick out too far, Say somebody finished the gun out, it was fine at their house. Next thing, they take it home, and all of a sudden, the bolt extends through, your hammer starts hitting. And if your customer overextends the bolt and it pushes this spring out, it's going to snap the stud off on the bottom of the spring. You start lifting that spring like this, something's going to give. And most of the time, it breaks the front homemade stud off when you prison it.
Question, when you put the rod in the wrist,
Yes, sir.
don't you have a problem with interference with the trigger and the sear?
Occasionally, you have to go in and cut a notch out. And that's when the rod is at its full length. Depends. Normally, I can get above it slightly, but it depends on your drop and your wrist architecture. As to, you may have to put a small notch in there for that sear on the top side. Better to do it on the front side before you glue it in than you do on the back side. They have to do it afterwards. Ramrod pipes. I tend to make most all my ramrod pipes from scratch. It's just, when you make your pipe, when you fold your pipe and you make your pipes, silver solder your pipe together. Because what happens, just like a lot of originals, what you run into is when a pipe, the piece of brass is folded sheet-wise over and it's not soldered together as a solid tube, what it does is, if your ramrod gets soaking wet and your ramrod swells, it swells out. So what's it do to your pipe? It flexes this pipe, and that's why so many old guns and some new ones split from pipe to pipe to pipe. They split down the ramrod because your channel on the bottom, the web's only maybe 200 thousandths thick, and so that's one of your weaker spots in your forestock. So if that pipe swells, I was hunting in New Mexico one time, and we had a soaking rain. It was soaked, and the pipes I had on the gun, the ramrod swelled up, couldn't get the ramrod out. And because it was a soldered pipe, a silver soldered pipe, it got stuck, but it didn't crack the forestock out. And then I ended up pulling the pin and then taking the tomahawk and cracking it off there to get it off. But what I'm saying is, you're better off with a stuck ramrod than you are a split stock. And so silver solder your pipes together so they can't. Also, when you make your pipes and you're inletting them, say that's your pipe, and you got a web like that. That's where a lot of the commercial ones are built. You're only holding that pipe in there. The pipe's there to hold your ramrod. It's not there to hold up a house. If you do a tab for your pin, do a little tiny tab. Don't relieve any more wood than you need to set the pipe. Leave a tiny tab that's just big enough that that pin can go through. Most of the time, I do 2 tabs on the front pipe, just for strength. So two pins on the front pipe, but the key is get all this material out of it, make it go away. Because the only thing you're doing is when you're setting that pipe down in there, you're splitting that wood. You're only making the problem worse by taking the whole linear split of wood out of there in your web. So put a tab front, tab back. I tend to do single tabs on the center pipe because it's got the least amount of stress. When your ramrod's sitting in there, this is the one that takes the stress. Your forward pipe is the guy that's going to take most of the stress. You're riding a horse. When you're riding a horse and your ramrod sticks out and you clip it, it's either going to break the rod or it's going to break the stock. And ramrods are a whole lot easier to make than guns. So 2 pins up here helps. Back here on the rear pipe, I tend to do 1 pin. Make sure you don't take any more wood so the pipe doesn't block. And then one of the things I do just before we're finished, and the originals have this too, Brown Buses do the same thing, that the pipe tab comes back, and then right at the tail of it, it has a little tiny finger that sticks out. And you can just simply silver solder one little touch of a finger that sticks out. And so it actually indexes underneath into your wood. You don't have to do it on the front side, you do it just before you finish out the rifle. So what it does is it keeps that pipe in the stock, the back of it. So if you whack it here, also when you're relieving the wood, try very carefully not to relieve any more wood underneath that pipe than you need. Because what it does is when you have that air space underneath of it, and it gets whacked right there, what it does is it goes down, splays out, and blows the sidewalls out of your mortise or your entry. You keep the wood in here. It's similar to the butt plate. Leave as much wood as you possibly can. Another feature I do on the rifles, I come back, that's a big thing, about right here, I can show you. Like you take a ramrod, you push it back, right there. Right there, there's a spring inside. What I do is do a little triangular cut under the barrel and a little slit that goes down into the ramrod channel so you can see the ramrod. Maybe about inch and a quarter long, something in that ballpark. And there's a little tiny leaf spring that I lay in. And so what it does is the little leaf spring lays in, curves down. About like that. And so what happens is when that ramrod comes through, what it does, it puts just enough tension to keep it from falling out. And so when you're riding a horse, I've been in Colorado different times, and most of the time everybody thinks you put the gun on the saddle. Well, you do. You'll ride with it on the pommel of the saddle. And everybody thinks, oh, you carry it where it balances. No. On a horse, you put it forward heavy. Because if you put it here every time you move, it does this. So you end up going forward heavy one. That's why some of the old guns have saddle wear here with the ramrod ship. So they were carried that much. But when you're going through the timber, you tend to tuck it up under your arm. You tuck it up under your arm down along your leg. Well, this ramrod starts to work its way out. All of a sudden, your gun that had a 40-inch barrel now has about a 50-inch barrel. And it grabs your rod here, and it's going to snap your rod off. Where if you just have this little, simple little spring laying in there, you don't have to pin it. It can just lay in there. And because the spring is shaped, the spring is pretty much like that on the backside. So when it sets in the triangular cutout that you put in, it won't go out the back. You're not going to lose it. It's just sitting in there underneath the barrel. So that helps a bunch. Also, your ramrod, when you build your gun, I tend to use a tapered rod. Finishes out about 5/16 at the back, and it's a little bigger than 3/8. You'll see on all the guns built, they have horn nose caps. The horn nose cap is for a couple things. You'll see it on a lot of European guns, especially Jaegers, tend to have horn nose caps. I've seen some Virginia rifles original that have the horn nose cap. I like the horn for a couple reasons in brass and steel. One is it doesn't wear the inside of your rifle. When you're shooting all the time, you're going down in there, you're burnishing your bore every single time you're slamming a ramrod down, especially if they have like a cleaning bag, so it's going to wear over the barrel. Another detail I like about it is it gives you a good balance. You get a good return. So when you set that ball down there with a horn tip on it, you get that with brass. But when you're using horn, you'll get a lot more return. And it's a little more forgiving to that lead ball there. So that's what I do. Also, when I'm building pipes, if you look at like my little rifle and this one, the pipe up here, I do a tapered pipe, and that's the fun part. If you're building your own pipes, you can make them exactly the way you want. You buy them; they're already pre-made. It's 5/16, 5/16, 5/16. or 3/8 all the way through. If you're making your own pipes and you're making your own ramrods and tapering this stuff, you can make this a little bigger than 3/8. You can start with a 1/2 inch of the bore size, big thing for this ramrod. So you can make a tapered rod from the front to the back. So I make the front pipe larger. Like if you take this pipe, it's bigger at the mouth than the back. So this side is as big as this one. This one's the size of this one. So they all taper slightly. It gives you a little bit different look. The main thing is when you get ready to load the gun, now you're not trying to fish a 5/16 tip into a little 5/16 hole. You're fishing it into something that's bigger than 3/8. And so you tend to get a better return. Get back home. Oh, let's see. Case hardening. If I say I too many times, sorry. I'll just tell you the way I do it. And you pick out what you like and roll it. I tend to like a case hardened lock. Case hardening is something you can do at home. You can do it in a wood stove if you want to. But case hardening, I case harden the tang bolt, triggers, trigger plates, all the screws while you're making the canister up. And if you're not familiar with case hardening in a Reader's Digest version, basically case hardening is where you're taking charcoal or carbon, whether you're putting bone in there to get color or not. I don't care about the color. I want the hardness. So you're putting your steel pieces and your metal pieces, even the forward pins a lot of times are put in the canister. So you put all that, pack it in there, get it airtight as you can, and put heat on it. So if you have a forge, heat it up with the forge. If you don't, you can get a weed burner and make your own little homemade forge and heat the canister up. That canister, you'll want it like warm. Because what's happening is you're speeding up this atom. So the principle is you're speeding up the surface of your parts. And so as that atom spins, it's encapsulated in carbon. And so it takes on more carbon molecules. And if you let it air cool, it'll release it. But if you quench it, it locks that carbon. And so what it does, especially when you do centric guns, I found that on very low-end Indian trade guns, they're case hardened. French guns are case hardened. A lot of the German locks that you see on Becks and Schroyers are case hardened. And the reason I know that, you may not see colors because they're 100 and something years old. But when I've done restoration, you have to do a conversion on one. As soon as you take a hacksaw, you touch that plate or any piece of it, it glances off like it's glass. And so that tells you, even through the rust, that piece was a case hardened piece. 18th century, they used wrought iron. So the way they're getting the longevity out of the wrought iron for durability, especially in locks, is the case hardened. What it does is that atom spinning is taking on carbon, you quench it, it locks the extra carbon. And like carbide is hard, so is the extra carbon on the outside of the steel pieces that you're putting in the canister. And what it does is a couple things. It's a little more rust resistant, but it makes like a bearing surface. So all of a sudden your hardened tumbler and your hardened mainspring are now rubbing against something that's as hard as they are. So it creates less friction, less drag. When you put a little oil in there, it makes it slick. And that's why a lot of the wonderful English locks that were made at the time, or even some of the French ones, when you feel them, they're smooth as glass because they went to the trouble to polish them up, and once they're case hardened, they stay there. So that's for the longevity of the gun and for durability, you'll find that things will hold up. I do the screws. It doesn't harden the inside, like on mild steel. It doesn't make the core harder. It just makes a candy apple coating that's around the outside of it for durability and longevity. Pipes, Ramrod, grain structure, stress. This is a lousy little rendition, but when you're doing your inlays, say you're putting in 4-in inlays, because so many times you'll see new people that they put their inlays in and the pins look horrible. Because you try to put a pin in a piece of silver or a piece of brass, and how much countersink you do. What I use at the house is just a sewing needle. You get one of these 3-sided sewing needles that the harness folks use. I chucked it up in one of these little drill bit vices things that you put in the drill, and it's a long taper. So what it does is, when you make your inlays and you drill your pinholes in there, if you use this a long taper, it gives you a long slope to it. And what it does is it tends to push metal as much as it cuts metal. So what happens is you have a flat piece of silver, and then you're putting your inlay in. What it does is you're reaming, so you have a long countersink, but it pushes a little bit of metal on the other side. Don't cut that off, because it's actually giving you more grip on your piece of silver. So you're actually, if it pushes down another half the thickness of the silver, that means when you put your pin in, it has more friction for the length. I tend to make the pins for the silver out of the same silver. So if you use a different silver, even if it's all supposed to be silver sterling or 99%, you'll see the coloration. If you use the same silver and the same thickness as what your inlay is, come in and put that in it. When you shape your pin down to a point. I tend to cut them with a jeweler's saw. If it's thicker, or I can use shears, hammer the pin. So instead of filing a little square piece of block perfectly round, lay it up on your vise and start to planish the thing and take the corners off of it. What that does is it work hardens your piece of silver. It makes the pin harder because you're beating the stink out of it. Also, leave the tip really, really pointy. So my goal is, and it may not always happen, I want it to look like this when it gets in the piece of wood. I want it to bottom out in the pin. So when you drill your little pilot hooks and put it up there and you say, okay, here's my little pilot hook. I don't want it to slip in there and just come back out. I want it to go in there. I want that little feathery pointed tip to fold over and make a hook out of that. So you get a little more grab in the pin down. And once you get it where you want it, and the pin's kind of proud and tall, say your pin's sticking up just a tiny bit, get on that pin, and before you beat the stink out of it, it swells out over top of your inlay. Just a tiny bit above it. Once it bottoms out, get in there with a pair of end cutters, snip it off, file it the way you want it, file it flat, and then lightly tap it. And when you're working the pin, don't, and this doesn't matter if you're making rivets for a knife. Say you're making a knife handle and you put rivets in it. If this is what your rod looks like, don't hit it in the center. Tap it all the way around the sides. Tap it around the sides. And what you'll end up doing, you'll make it look like a snow cone. So you'll get that effect. Tap it around so it swells out a little bit. And then once you get that, send it home. Because on a pin like this, what it does is you start tapping around the edges, it fattens the top of the pin. And normally I do it, I got one of those little hand vices, like a little jeweler's hand vice. And you can sit there and see it, but you can't see that good. So, and you can tap it to get that. And then when you seat that in there, don't overhit it. Once you've got this and you know that's bottomed out, just go ahead and tap it down and then file it off. I mean, you're welcome to look at any of the guns I got on the table. But this rifle has probably, this little deer on it has probably a minimum of 12 to 15 pins in it. It's got them in the little legs and stuff. They're little tiny guys, but it keeps everything held in. Any questions? Yes,
so your pin is actually straight when you put it in, and then once you hammer it home, that's when it takes on the flare.
Yes, I start out with a square piece that I slice off the same piece of silver. Then I lay it on the vise, tap the corners down to start making it round. Throw it up in the hand vise and kind of hand smooth it so it is roundish, but fully tapered. So it's tapered from all the way down. If you want to, and you have to put your inlay in, and you can go ahead and cut all your inlays and pre-test them and see if they fit and see how long they go through your silver.
So it is tapered before you put it in?
Yes,
okay.
It's fully tapered. And what I'm looking for is I want it to bottom out in the hole. I don't want it to do this. I don't want it to go down into a cylinder hole with nothing there. I want it to hit meat. I want it to get down in there, and I want it to fold it. Now, if you're doing the inlays on the forestock, you can also put your pins through the forestock and then clinch them on the inside. I've seen that on the original. So they let the silver pin go through. They don't cut it off. They just clinch them down inside. So you know the pins. That's another thing that we cover is that when you're putting pins on wedges or keys, and you're doing the keys coming out here and you're putting silver inlays, just know that it comes back to this shrinkage issue. Many of the old inlays get knocked off of the gun because the shrinkage happens this way and it takes this pin and jacks it crooked. So when you put this pin in, a corner of that thing catches the inlay and blows it off the backside. One thing that you can do to help that is when you make your inlays on the front, is go ahead and file them slightly cone shaped. So when that inlay gets through there, it has a little bit of leeway so it doesn't catch a corner. And also soften these corners so when it comes through. I tend to like to be able to feel the pins on both sides. That's just personal. Nose caps, I'll cover nose caps real quick. Basically construction of them, because somebody was asking me about that earlier, which we'll talk about. When you do your nose cap, or at least when I'm working at the house, I tend to make my wood look exactly as if it had a nose cap. If you want a groove in it, that's fine. Shape it, step it down, make this forestock look like it had a nose cap. Then come through with the jeweler saw and make, say you want a 2-inch cap, come down here and cut with your jeweler saw the thickness. So the jeweler saw should be the same thickness as the brass that you're putting around it. So you make one little saw curve back here on the back, and then right up here towards the muzzle, leave a little piece of wood on the front and do another saw curve. Then what that allows you to do is take wood from this point to that point between the two saw curves, still leave this little wrap of wood in the front, and what that allows you is a depth gauge. So when you're all said and done and you take, whether you're using a chisel, but no, I just use a little rasp and file, go ahead and cut that wood all the way in. Same thing down here, take your knife, take a little gouge, and leave this piece of wood in front. So what it does is when you're all said and done, you have leave just enough wood for your piece of brass, no more. And then the last thing you do is just take a knife or the file or rasp and take that little ring off the front. So you know already, you're already at the right depth for your nose cap thickness. Take your piece of sheet brass that you're using, shear it. I take a piece of paper normally so I can waste the brass. Take a piece of paper, wrap it around and say, okay, it's this by this. Lay it on a piece of brass, shear that out. And if you never worked with it, with brass much, you'll know that it's got different properties than steel. If you heat it up red hot and you quench it in water, it makes it soft, it makes it dead soft. So you say, okay, I don't want my nose cap being dead soft because of structure. We'll put some temper back in it towards the end of the process, because what happens is you take that soft piece of brass, you can literally lay it, especially if you're not going to groove on one. You can lay that piece of brass on there with your fingers, fold that brass all the way around the sides of the mortise that you make. Make your two cut lines up the side, then go ahead and either shear them or cut them with a saw. Tuck them in, and then hand fit this so it fits tight. You can lay a piece of 3/8 rod in a vise and keep tapping using it as your mandrel to fold the edges in. And once those edges are folded on, that you can take that nose cap and with like a swamp barrel, what I do is I take the nose cap backwards. I take the nose cap almost like a sight shield and run it up this way and fold it and come back down. And what that does is it's going to flex it a little bit, but it gives you the opportunity to fit that nose cap super tight. Make sure all your gaps are good. Then come back and make your front piece. You got two options there. One is you can flush mount it on the top of your brass. I don't like it because it shows the silver solder seam around the edges.
I tend to do a flush internal. It's not that much harder. Take a piece of the same brass, lay it on the top, scribe around the octagon, cut that octagon out, and hand fit it so it slips up on there. You got your piece wrapped around there, slip that piece of brass over the top and scribe the underside. And then if you're going to recess it down in the hole, when you're getting ready to use your jeweler's saw to cut that profile out, you just come in and cut with your saw just the thickness of what this brass sheet is. And so you hand fit it until that piece fits down inside of the end cap. So now you've got a fully done cap, except it needs silver saw. So you slip him over there, put it in the vise so it's set upright. Go ahead and flux it on the inside. Make sure all the scale, everything's cleaned off the inside of the pipe, but don't clean up too far back, because what will happen is when you get your flux on there, the silver saw is going to run farther back than you want. It's running on the front. Put your flux around it, and then when I start with the torch. Say that's your nose cap, your octagon stuff here. Start with your torch up on this corner. Touch your silver solder off here. Most of the time, if you put a little goblet there, just a little dot, you can take your torch and walk that solder, and it'll chase your flame. And you just walk it right around here, and you'll see it come through. It'll suck right all the way through. And don't quench it after that, because what you just did is you tempered the whole cap. And when I hold the nose cap for that process, I use a pair of needle nose vice grips. So I'm just pinching the side of it so it lets as much heat comes back on the whole cap. So when you heat it and you suck the silver solder through and you're heating this hole back here, you can run the torch back there and let that air hold. And now you'll be back to a springy, hard piece of brass. Fit it back on there, clean it up, and you've got a finished nose cap. Normally, if I was at home doing it, it's like an hour and 10 minutes to an hour and a half process to make a cap. And that's with a Ramrod. Once you start making your own caps, you'll be so much happier for a couple reasons. You'll stop making the forestock fit the commercial cap. You'll probably be using thicker brass for the stock for your nose cap than you did before, because you can get away with a thicker piece of brass to be able to form the nose caps out. You'll get a better fit on the muzzle because you're not trying to hand fit this purchased cap or trying to tuck the corners to make up for the fact that it doesn't fit your barrel. Also, your cap will be tapered. Because you're doing a swamp barrel and the way you made it, your cap will actually have the flare to go along with what your barrel is. Where if you buy most commercial ones, they're not tapered because they end up with the center. Riveting, there's a couple options. Don't just glue a cap. You can glue a cap if that's what you want to do, that's fine. But the originals almost always had a minimum, sometimes 1, 2, or 3 rivets. You can use brass if you want, you can use copper, it doesn't matter. If you're doing a JP Beck tends to use a swage nose cap. Swage nose caps tend to need a mantle made to do that. It's a process where the tip actually curves up. Sometimes you can even tell in the pictures because they don't have a sharp edge, and they'll tend to be rounded. That's a swage cap. Most of the time they had a mantle for it. Years ago, there was a fellow that had a setup that he would do where he would show you make caps while you're in the process of peeling. But rivet wise, you're doing a JP Beck, there tends to be on average, there's 1 in the front, 2 down here on the side. On the side. And I say on the side because basically what it is, it's a pin that's coming in exactly on that flat. Exactly on the flat. Whether you're making rivets or copper rivets or whatever, you want that rivet on the inside. Say that's your wood. You want your rivet. You can use a tapered one if you want, but normally your rivet will have a pin on the top. And here again, it's coming through the brass. Countersink the brass just a little bit, If you can, make a reamer that makes a longer taper. So when you rivet, just touching on rivets, it goes back to this same principle. When you're peening any of the rivets and your pin comes out, don't allow the pin to be longer than it needs to be. Once that pin's coming up just above the surface, that's where you want to stop. There's a fine line, because when people make rivets, you tend to, if you leave it too long, you start pounding on it, it bends it. And what it does is it moves everything. Or if you're doing a lock, or if you're doing a knife slabs, it cracks the slab, because it starts to do this, you cracks your slab. So the key is, don't let it be too tall. Come in with a tiny hammer, planish or peen all the way around the outside of it. And once you get it to the point that it's almost tight to whatever the material is that you're going in, tap it on the top, and that will swage it out, and then cut it off and seat it up. Any questions? No questions? Okay. I don't think I've missed anything I can think of. Main thing is, in the finish process, just going back over a few things. Structure-wise, make sure to get plenty of finish in the bottom of the barrel channel. Make sure to get finish put down in the ramrod hole. Do it on the front side when you're putting your first couple of coats on it, because when you're putting that finish on there, it's going to run in places all over the place. If you do it towards the end when you're at your final surface desired, it'll end up making streaks and things that you don't want to deal with. So when you put those first couple coats on, I tend to thin my finish down with like turpentine in the beginning, so I get more penetration. It makes it a little bit softer, a little more penetration getting down into the wood surface itself. Make sure to get the inside of the butt plate. I normally give it at least a couple coats inside the lock. You may have to relieve some wood to get it out of there, but still go ahead and get that taken care of. Structure-wise, a lot of this is common sense, but when you have your rifle like in half cock, you want just a minor bit of play. So many guns you see, you pick them up, there's a lot of slop in the trigger, and then when you get ready to pull it, there's always this big gap slot. Think about whether you can build a perfect gun or not. I've never built one to happen. Do the very best that you can. It's always nice to try to do something higher than you did the last time. But the key is whatever you're doing, whether it's putting a butt plate on or trigger guard or whatever, do the nicest fit that you possibly can. Wire work, the only thing I can tell you with, like, if you're putting silver wire in, I used to do demonstrations here at Dixon's years ago. The silver wire, when you're putting it in, you take a standard piece of silver wire, say that's your silver wire rivet, and you're going to inset that in your piece of wood. If you just set that in there, the probability of it pulling out of there is very high. You can actually just pull it right out of it. If you take it, I've got a little jig on the bench at the house, a little piece of wood that sets and has a little tiny jeweler's saw kerf in it. So when I slip a piece of silver wire through, it leaves that silver wire just the tiniest bit high above the wood surface. I take a big wood chisel and I pull it through. So I sit there like a little jackhammer going, tap, 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 and just pull that ribbon right on through there. And what it does, it makes little burrs, little tiny bites all the way out. The more bites you put in, the better. The less bites you put in, when you get ready to make a turn with it, it will want to kink where those bites are. So the more bites you put in, the more even it is when you get ready to make some kind of a balloon or curve, you'll be able to make it better. What that burring does is when you cut that channel, you cut with your chisel. I make little thin. So some people use a knife, I tend to use a little chisel for most of it. When you make that little slice in there and you open it up, when you put this piece of wire in there, and it's got little burrs on the bottom, When this gets any moisture, humidity to it, or wood finish, it'll seal it and pinch that piece of wire. And I used to demonstrate, you could take a piece of wire that didn't have the burr, you could cut 2 inches on a piece of wood and slip that one in there, put water to it. You take it over here and do 2 inches and put a piece in there that had the burr in it. This one you'll slip right out. That one you can't pull. It'll break off before you can pull it out of the piece of wood. So that's why when you see like wire up on the comb, especially the curved areas, it's much more difficult. And the little sidebar on that is it's a pain, but when you're going on a curve and you have a tip that's down over there on the side that you're trying to keep in there, a couple things you can do. One is you can, before you put burrs on, you can planish one side of your wire so it makes a curve in your wire before you make that radius coming over the top. Also, you can take your tip, the tip of your wire where it's deadheading here, and make a little cut. And take this part out, and what it does, it leaves that little burr. So when you make your channel down on that side, you go in there and you make a little stake, a little pop in there, and it gives a little hook to help keep those points down on the side. So there's nothing worse than grabbing a hold of the gun and you slip your hand back and a piece of wire sticks in there. Any other questions?
So when you're talking about the sewing needles,
Yes,
putting
sir.
pins in, can you go over, are you drilling your pinhole and then running a sewing needle down there for that taper? Was that the procedure?
Yeah, so normally if I'm putting an inlay on there, I go through and I go with the little needle bits. A lot of times you can pick them up at a weld shop because they use them to clean the torch heads and stuff. Go in there and drill your hole. And then as soon as I get through the silver, then I go through with a bigger or a tinier bit and make a little pile. And then take your inlay off. I'm going to take it off, but if you can't take it off. You can actually ream this in the wood itself. And the sewing needle is one of these 3-sided ones, guys, like that. That's real long and tapered. And then sometimes you can actually, especially if it's thin silver, you don't even need the drill or anything. You can just take your finger and burr it like that. And like I say, it burnishes at the same time it's cutting. So it'll actually push metal down and through the bottom of it. So what it does is it gives you that more friction space instead of your thin silver. It actually gives you more space where your silver pin is in connection with the end. And so it gives that. And then when you're tapping, the main thing is don't leave the pin too long and beat the stink out. Because if you beat it too much, all of a sudden it makes a cup in your inlay. So then you're trying to get this cup out of there. Number one is you probably cut the mortise too deep for the silver inlay. It had a pocket in there. And so what happens is when you put the pin in, all of a sudden it sticks like that. And then you're trying to file everything to get down to that level. And the problem is, depends on how thick your silver is, but you've already cut the heads off of all these other guys trying to get this one guy so he didn't show. And so if you do it well and perfect your technique, you'll get to the point that people will look at it and say, there's no pins in this. Well, it's all because it's the same material. It's a long tapered countersink. If you make too big of a countersink, and I can tell you this because I did it wrong, right, is you make a countersink that's big. Well, what happens is when you come in here and you start sanding, these little feather edges will fly off, and all of a sudden your pin shows. Or you come in with an engraver and you're trying to engrave it, and you come through and you catch the top of the pin, and all of a sudden the whole round comes off. So if it's a long cone taper, so it's more cone shaped than it is really a taper, when your pin gets in there, it gives you that much more material. And you don't have a feather edge. It's actually like this, not so much on the top. You don't want the pin head on the top. You just want it all the way through the surface and into the material. That cover for you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? About anything? Patchbox, releases, or any of the above? Okay. I think we're good to go. Thank you, guys.